Hello, folks. Thank you again for joining us for another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman, the Manager of Education and Public Programs at MHS. Today is April 8th, 2021, and tonight's program is a book talk, The Village Blacksmith with John Babin, and our special guest, Nick Bass-Baines. John Babin is the author of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Portland, the Fireside Poet of Maine, published by History Press. John's work as a research assistant has been acknowledged in a number of published books and articles, and he works at Maine Historical Society and the Wadsworth Longfellow House as the Visitor Services Manager. And also joining us this evening, our friend Nick Bass-Baines, who is the author of Cross of Snow, A Life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Thank you both so much for being here and taking some time to talk about Henry Longfellow with us this evening. I know our audience joins me in thanking you both. So John, whenever you're ready to go, you can begin. Please tell us more about this newest publication, The Village Blacksmith.
Okay, well, before we talk a little bit about The Village Blacksmith, I just want to get out some thank yous because doing a children's book, this being my first, I didn't realize how much work this truly is. And I'll tell you, the idea came from Melissa Spurl. She used to be the museum store manager. And she thought that this would be a great idea to bring to young readers. So Melissa, thank you so much for the great idea and thank you for sharing it with me. The illustrations that we're using are original 1890 Garrett and Merrill original illustrations, and those are from an 1890 Village Blacksmith book. And they were digitally enhanced and remastered by Sophia Image Services coordinator and collections technician for MHS. And then the support of MHS, Karen Pelletier, Steve Bromage, Jamie Rice, Tiffany Lank, all these folks helping here at MHS, and then writing a children's book. Not knowing much about it, what they do is they give you a children's literature assessment and basically go through the whole manuscript and just see if it's going to fit and be comfortable for young readers, you know. And so that was done, and I was finished. I thought I was totally finished with the book until the literary assessment was done. And when that was done, there were suggestions that were just great suggestions, and we had to basically start all over again. That's where Rebecca Foster comes in. Rebecca is the person who originally looked at the manuscript, first one to ever read it. She ended up doing all the edits. So when the literary assessment came back, I'm scratching my head going, oh, I don't want to add anything. It's going to be clunky. You know, what am I going to do? And so I start adding things, and it was Rebecca who said, yes, okay, we can do this. It's too wordy. We're going to fix it. We're going to get it there. And that's how we got to where we are. And then it finally goes to the publishers. Maine Authors Publishing. Just thank you so much, folks over there. Nikki, Dan, Mercedes, Jane, Christina, and Michelle. In the book, I have definitions for certain words that young children will just not understand today. And one of the great ideas that Michelle had was that she would bold that particular word in the stanza, and then it would be bolded again at the bottom, and we would have the definition. So as you're reading a stanza and you see a word, particular word that's bolded that you don't understand, there's a definition for it. So, you know, those are the thank yous. I just want to make sure that I got those in because it was quite a project. I was surprised how much work really went into it.
Well, this is a congratulations then to everybody on the team that pulled this project together.
Yep, everybody did a great job, you know. So are we going to do the poem?
So yeah, we thought we would open this evening with reading the poem and showing folks the illustration from the book. So John had graciously invited me to be the reader. So I have my copy of the book here. And John, whenever you're ready to start the slideshow, go right ahead and we'll begin.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. The Village Blacksmith, a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. The smith, a mighty man is he, with large and sinewy hands. The muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. His hair is crisp and black and long. His face is like the tan. His brow is wet with honest sweat. He earns whate'er he can. Look the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. Week in, week out, from morn till night, you can hear his bellows blow. You can hear him swing his heavy sledge with measured beat and slow, like a sexton ringing the village bell when the evening sun is low. And children coming home from school look in at the open door. They love to see the flaming forge and hear the bellows roar, and catch the burning sparks that fly like chaff from a threshing floor. He goes on Sunday to the church and sits among his boys. He hears the parson pray and preach. He hears his daughter's voice singing in the village choir, and it makes his heart rejoice. It sounds to him like her mother's voice, singing in paradise. He needs must think of her once more, how in the grave she lies, and with his hard, rough hand he wipes a tear out of his eyes. Toiling, rejoicing, sorrowing, onward through life he goes. Each morning sees some task begin, each evening sees it close. Something attempted, something done, has earned a night's repose. Thanks, thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught. Thus at the flaming forge of life our fortunes must be wrought. Thus on its sounding anvil shaped each burning deed and thought.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
It's
Appreciate
my
it.
pleasure. So, John, can you tell us a little bit more about inspired you to try and bring this poem to a new generation of readers? I know you spoke of the museum store manager who kind of inspired the idea. What is it about this particular poem that you think is special?
You know, it's basically it's the typical Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem about the average worker, the poem that is going to basically be a poem that can be read to the family, you know, and then in linking in the fireside poets. So I really think it just stays true to, you know, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, wanting to write for families, wanting to write a story of just a man who's doing a good, honest day's work. Hey, Nick, how do you feel about this poem?
I love it, John. And I think when I was listening to your explanation of why this particular poem was chosen for launch a children's book series, I said, what a splendid choice when you think that the children of Cambridge, Massachusetts sent him, we're jumping ahead, I guess, but the spreading chestnut tree that begins the poem on Brattle Street in the original Dexter Pratt blacksmith shop, which was the model for Henry's poem. When they took down the tree in 1872 or 3 or 4, I guess it was, and the children of Cambridge purchased a chair, an armchair to be made hewn from the wood, and they presented it to Henry on his birthday. And he wrote that wonderful poem, From My Armchair, and he thanks the children of Cambridge. So when I think of a poem to start a children's series, this gift to the children of Cambridge that Henry presented and their response with a gift to him, I think you couldn't have picked a better choice. And those illustrations, I have to say, are just splendid. I love them.
I was just very, very fortunate to find them. You know, like I said, it's been kind of a 5-year project, and then all of a sudden, I had ordered in a number of blacksmith copies, and one of them came. This particular one, I think, might have been one of them that I purchased from Europe, which had these illustrations in it, and I just went, oh my goodness, I've struck upon a gold mine, and did the research to make sure that they could be used. But you bring up a great story about From My Armchair, the poem that he wrote to the children of Cambridge. And I talk about that in the story about Henry in the book. And I also end the book with that particular poem. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Nick. That was great.
It's a very important poem for a number of reasons, because Henry never by name identifies the blacksmith in the poem.
Mhm.
And it is quite unusual for Henry. I believe it's probably the first time that he used a living person, an actual living person, as the model for a poem. He would do it some years later with Florence Nightingale, and then when he did the Tales of a Wayside Inn, he used living models. But for the most part, he based poems on deceased people, but still he doesn't name Pratt in the poem. So there has been some speculation that maybe it was another blacksmith shop. And we have a little anecdote we could tell a little later in the program about how a blacksmith shop down in Blackstone, down in Uxbridge, they believe they were the Blackstone. They believe they were the model for the poem. But in that poem, Henry makes it very clear. He's talking about the Chestnut Street. He doesn't name Brattle Street, but he says, I used to walk by here. There's the blacksmith, the smithy doing his work. So he's very clear in that poem as to the location of the blacksmith shop and the individual he's writing about without again identifying him. So it's a very, very, very important poem from a bibliographical standpoint, I think,
Yeah, and like you said, you bring up Oxbridge. What I talk about in the book, in the story about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, I say that it was not one blacksmith shop that inspired him to write this poem. He had mentioned in letters and journals that there was one up by his grandfather's house in Gorham. That was another.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about a number of different blacksmith shops, but I like your story in your book, Cross of Snow, about the one in Oxbridge.
Well, what's cute about that is that in 1926, now jumping ahead to the 20th century, Henry Ford purchased this authentic smithy shop from Uxbridge because he believed this to have been the model for the poem, and Ford was so impressed, and he said, influenced by Longfellow's poetry. He gave credit to the Psalm of Life for having helped him become the person that he was, and that's the reason why he bought the Wayside Inn and saved it from destruction. And we wanted to add to that with purchasing this blacksmith shop. Some years later, I believe his name was Caleb Taft, sent Henry a small anvil that he had forged from an original anvil in the shop, and he sent it to Henry as a gift. And in 1972, the National Park Service had found this box in the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, and it was unopened, and there was a note in Henry's hand, and I can send you a copy of the note. And Henry wrote, so I'll read to you exactly what he wrote. He said, bit of anvil, 100 years old, from Mr. Taft, blacksmith of Blackstone, 1879. And that was it. That's all. He doesn't say that, I think he was mindful of the fact that other people were claiming themselves as the model. And I think he thought that's fine. As many people as, are influenced by it, so much the better. And I think, as you point out, it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid and it's a model. And but I think he kind of encouraged it a little bit, because he doesn't say one way or the other that this anvil is from the blacksmith shop that I used. He kept it. He kept, as you know, thousands of things. I think he did the same thing in the Wadsworth Longfellow House up in Portland. I mean, there are all sorts of things that the Longfellow family preserved. And Henry would write little notes identifying what they were. This one is very interesting in that it wasn't opened until 1972, and there was the little anvil in there, and they still have it in the collections over there.
I'm so glad you told that story. I wanted you to tell that one. And another one in your book that I really like was when Dickens came to visit. He was in the stagecoach, and then he wanted to get out and walked, and he walked right by the Village Blacksmith shop and by the spreading chestnut tree. And that was the same year that he was going to release the poem in a
That's
book,
correct.
because it had only been done in the Knickerbocker before.
And
So,
what Dickens, and then Henry, this was 1842 when Dickens came to this was his first American tour, and he and the Longfellow became great fast friends. And Henry took him on this walking tour. He claimed of 10 miles, and it's possible, all along the waterfront into Charlestown and by Bunker Hill and all that. And then he invited him to breakfast over at what was known as Craigie House at the time, where he was living. And Dickens took the stagecoach from Boston to Cambridge, and then he walked from what is now Harvard Square down Brattle Street to the Longfellow House, and he walked right by 54 Brattle, where the original blacksmith shop stood. And in fact, I think this chestnut tree was still there. So Dickens walked right by it, mindful of that. And then he invited Henry to visit him in England, which Henry did later that year. And by that time, the poem had been published in Ballads and Other Poems, which is Longfellow's second book of poetry. And Dickens bought a number of these. He bought a supply of these. And as he introduced Henry about London and took him to various places, Dickens, presented copies of Longfellow's book containing this poem in particular that he wanted his friends in England to have and to enjoy. So it's a continuing story. It goes on, and which I think is so much a wonderful part of the whole thing.
yeah, and then also you talk about in the book, and I just got a kick out of it, how many times that the Village Blacksmith was actually made into a movie.
8 times. Well, if there were cartoons and parodies, and there was a John Ford one where he used an auto mechanic. But this was this is typical of Longfellow. When we talk today about how extraordinarily popular and influential he was, that's just one poem. I mean, how many movies were done of Hiawatha? How many were done of Evangeline? Cities and actual states, Kansas and Iowa. What is it? What's the other one? Kansas and Iowa have Hiawatha. You have named towns after characters in Longfellow poems. I mean, the influence was overwhelming. And when you think of how this poem in particular, because it does really take an honest trade, a man who's working hard to support his family, to raise his family, to instill moral values, all the really admirable things. It's a perfect story for children, and it just resonates in so many levels for me, and obviously as it does for you, and I'm sure as it will for you, for the readers of this nice little book that you've done.
Well, thank you so much. Do appreciate it. But there's just so many stories. I mean, we could go on, forever about Longfellow's work, and that's really the true reason why I really want to do a series of these books to introduce his poetry to young readers.
The perfect choice, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, this is Melissa Spurl was the, one who picked this one. So, I'm looking at a number of different ones. One I want to do as part of this series is Christmas bells. And I think we talked about that in the last interview that you and I did together.
Well, what inspired it, yeah.
Yeah, that how many people recorded Christmas bells, I mean, it's just, and his work, is still being recorded today. So,
one thing we could point out about this poem is another, how do you describe it as a poem? There's a phrase they use, an occupational poem, and this was very popular in that day. You take a certain occupation or a trade and you write a poem about it. And he was writing about blacksmithing, but Henry did another one that was a little more sophisticated, but had tremendous appeal and continued, is The Building of the Ship. And, is up in Maine, of course, where Henry grew up. He was very familiar with shipbuilding, and he really describes the process of design and building, and he does it with a master shipwright. And it's been said, there was a famous British architect, maritime architect, who said it's the greatest poem ever likely to be written about the building of a ship. And that's the famous poem where it's sail on, O Union, strong and great. So, you know, that wonderful line, humanity, I can't do it from off the top of my head, but that magnificent 6 lines where he talks about sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great. And the ship is named Union. So ostensibly the poem is about shipbuilding, but it goes a lot deeper. And there's a lot of depth and, you know, we might think, okay, this appeals to children, but it's not just for children. This is the mistake so many people make with Longfellow. They say because his poetry is so accessible and so beautiful to read aloud, as Kathleen, I think, just demonstrated just earlier, there's depth there. There's resonance that he's saying things to us that go beyond the description of a trade and an occupation. And anyway, I think it's a marvelous choice.
So tell us more about the connection to the chair that you were both talking about earlier. What's the connection between this poem, The Village Blacksmith, to the chair in Henry's study, and the poem that he writes about that chair?
Well,
So
go ahead, John, I'm sorry.
yeah, so the blacksmith had in front of, that shaded over the shop, was a beautiful chestnut tree. And as Cambridge was starting to grow, they wanted to widen the streets. So, right, Nick? And then
Precisely.
yeah. And then what year was that they took down the tree?
You know, I think it's right around the time they actually made the chair. I think it could be 1879, 1878. You know, it's around that time. It's in the 1870s.
So the chair is made from the wood of the chestnut tree.
And designed by one of Henry's nephews or whatever, Edwin Preble, whatever the name of, I think his nephew designed it from that wood.
Right.
For a special gift to Henry.
Yeah, it was designed by Henry's nephew and
Stephen's son, I think, right? Maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And then it was built by Hartwell, who did it. And I talk about that in the story about Longfellow. So, you know, I talk about also in the story that the poet protested the cutting down of the chestnut tree. He was not happy whatsoever. But you know, as much clout as people may have thought he had with his fame, he didn't have enough to save that tree.
No, it's too bad.
Yeah.
You know,
you can see, I've shared a photograph of the tree that exists on, not the tree, excuse me, the chair that's on Main Memory Network. And you can still see that chair, right? If you visit Henry's house in Cambridge, that's where it lives.
It's right in his study, the first floor study. That study is essentially identical to as it was when he occupied it, including that chair over by the fireplace. And Charles Sumner used to sit in it when he came in to visit, and Henry sat in a kind of a long, easy chair facing it. It's absolutely, you can't sit in it, obviously, but yes, absolutely, it's still there, and it's quite a beautiful chair. Good.
We have a question. We have a question from someone in the audience, from Harriet, who asks, "What do you think of the reference in The Village Blacksmith to his children's mother, quote, singing in paradise?" You know, is this? It's a brief reference in the poem. Do you think Henry might be referencing the mother of his children who died so tragically? But I think this poem.
That can't be, because Fanny doesn't die until 1861. Right. So this poem is 1840, so it can't be that. But what it could be is because Henry says in one of his Harvard lectures that because he teaches Dante and he becomes the first American to translate all of Dante into English. He does that after Fanny's death. But the image of Beatrice is always in his mind. And Beatrice we associate with Fanny. And he does say often that even though he can't see her, he can feel her presence. And that could be, that could be an echo of Dante, not his wife, because the wife that died tragically, that's 21 years in the future. So it couldn't be that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the illustrations. Like, John, how did you come across the illustrations that you use in the book? Why did you decide to use them for this particular publication?
Well, it was a stroke of luck. We had talked about doing the Village Blacksmith. I had interviewed a couple of young illustrators that I wanted to use. They were attending college. I thought it would be great. But with their studies coming up, they just weren't able to produce them. And so I was kind of at a standstill. I did not have somebody that could do the illustrations. And so just keep researching and working on the book. That's when I started ordering different copies of it. Like I said, this one particular one was the 1890 version with the Garrett and Merrill illustrations in them. And when I saw them, I was just, there's a lot of other illustrations in other Village Blacksmith books, but these were just, I just, once I saw them, I knew they would be perfect. And what I always try to do is in my writing, I want to stick to when I, do excerpts from Henry's letters. I always make sure they're exactly the way that he wrote them, kind of being a little bit of a purist there. And when I saw these, I just said, this is it. These are the ones. And they proved to really work out well. Everybody who's seen the product so far really enjoys them. So it was a stroke of luck just to be able to find them and to be able to use them. So.
Folks, just a reminder, if you have questions for our speakers, don't hesitate to type those into the Q&A or into the chat feature. So John, you said, this is going to be part of a series for young readers. And I know that we often encourage folks that want to introduce young people to poetry, that Henry is a really great poet to start with. So what do you think is next in this series? It sounds like maybe Christmas bells, or do you have any other thoughts?
Next in the series definitely is going to be My Lost Youth. Okay. And I'm hoping that Nick will tell a great little story about My Lost Youth. It's a great poem. It's about Portland. It's a visit that he did in 1848, but the poem wasn't written until 1855. Hey, Nick, you want to tell a little bit about that story?
It's just, it's a great poem, and it's he's looking back on his lost youth growing up in Portland, and I just love his recollection. He remembers when he was 6 years old and he heard the cannonade out in the bay out there when that famous battle during the War of 1812, and remembers the two captains, the funeral of the two captains. As this is quite a battle that happened, and that both skippers, the British skipper and the American skipper, died in the conflict. And the Americans carried the day, and the ship came, the British ship was taken as a prize of war. And as a tribute, this is almost unprecedented, you never hear of it. And I asked you, do you think that procession went by the Wadsworth House, Wadsworth Longfellow House at that point? And we don't really know, but it must have been very close. It must have gone down Congress Street. And they were buried. These two captains were buried. I imagine they're still there, right, at the cemetery in Portland. And side by side, the two skippers from the opposing battles, the opposing skippers from the opposing ships. So it was actually, I called the very first chapter of my book, Cross of Snow, The Wind's Will. And it was Henry looking back on his lost youth, remembering growing up in Portland. And it was a perfect way for me to kind of get into the story of his birth in Portland and his going to Bowdoin and getting ready to find his awakening in Europe when he travels off to Europe at the age of 18. He goes to Bowdoin College. He begins Bowdoin College at the age of 15, he and his brother Stephen, and he graduates fourth in his class in 1825 with one of his classmates is Nathaniel Hawthorne. And on his graduation day, he's offered a job to teach at Bowdoin languages and literatures, but he has to go off and learn these languages first. And his parents have such trust in him, an 18-year-old boy. They allow him to go to Europe for 3 years, and he just becomes this traveler, this man of the world. And you see all of this in that poem. You see a lot of this being prefigured. He talks about the Spanish sailors walking on the docks of Portland when he's growing up. They inspired thoughts, dreams of exotic places. And I think he's looking back wistfully at where he got his beginnings and how it really helped shape his life. So the poem, again, as we've said about the Village Blacksmith, it resonates in so many really wonderful levels. I think it's a perfect choice. Wonderful, wonderful choice.
You do in the first chapter of your book, Cross of Snow, you have at the top of the first chapter what Henry thought about when he wrote My Lost Youth, and it's March 29th, and he said, I lied in bed and I thought about a poem of Portland, and then March 30th, he
Next
writes,
day, it's done. It's done.
yeah.
And he said, and I used as a refrain the old Lapland song, a boy's use, the wind's will is a boy's will, and I can't do it off the top of my head, but
the boy's will is a wind will,
boy's will is the
and
wind's
thoughts
will.
of youth, the long thoughts.
And he uses that as a refrain in every stanza. And he had that. And then again, how this, a Lapland song, this comes from his having traveled to Europe and learning, 6 or 7 languages the first time. He goes back 10 years later and learns 6 or 7 more. He was fluent. What do you say? A dozen languages? What do we figure? A dozen, 15? I mean, he was multilingual, not just able to speak and to read, but to translate and to introduce these literatures. And here he is writing that poem and is recalling a line from an old Lapland poem. I mean, who else in America could have done that? When you think about it, who else could have conjured up a line from an old poem? From a foreign literary tradition like that, and Longfellow is one of the only ones who could have done that, in my view.
Yeah, it's a real fun poem. Just thinking about the walk that he took and going up to Munjoy Hill, and this was this 1846 visit that he talks about, going up to Munjoy Hill and going to the old Fort Lawrence, and he's basically just lays down in the grass and he can feel the ocean at his feet, and he says it's luring and lushing, and so he remembers this vivid memory, and then and what is it 9 years later he writes the poem. So just like the Village Blacksmith, I mean he remembers these things as a young man and then brings them all back later. So
yeah, it's great.
Just amazing talent all the way around.
We're really fortunate, I think, at Maine Historical Society to still have the Wadsworth Longfellow House now as a museum, to be able to still visit and share with people the place that really inspired so much of Henry's work. Like My Lost Youth is a good example. This is the house that Henry grew up in, the city that he grew up in, and he finds a lot of inspiration in that poem, in the place that he lived. John, can you, for the audience, tell them a little bit more about Henry's house here in Portland?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And I just want to bring up something that Nick brought up earlier. Nick was talking about the building of the ships. Well, there's a painting inside the living room called The Building of the Ships, okay? And you think about the home Henry lived in, you talk about the Staffordshire china, the blue willow pattern that he wrote in Caramos, and, the building of the ships. There's so many different things that Henry writes about. Coming up in the second part of the series in the My Lost Youth book, I will be putting in a second poem, which is called Musings, which is about Henry on the 3rd floor bedroom, looking out onto the harbor. You can see all the way out to the Portland headlight, and he's writing about looking over the rooftops of the town. So a lot of inspiration that he had, and the house is just an amazing place because this particular home was left to the Maine Historical Society by his sister Anne. Anne lived in the home until she was 90 years old. She died in 1901, leaving the home and the furnishings inside. She actually left 7 pages of instructions on how certain things were to stay and remain exactly the same. So when you walk into the Longfellow house, even though we have done some renovations as far as the wall coverings and paint is concerned, you're still looking at the house the way that the poet remembered it, the furniture and certain pieces of the furniture in the exact places not to be moved, because of Anne wanting people to know what the house was like. This was a place of inspiration for Henry. He returned to the home sometime every year. And Anne said that not only did he, work on poetry, but some of his most famous poems were written there. She talks about his book Hyperion being written in the summer dining room. So, it's, if you really want to learn more about the poet, this home, along with the home in Cambridge, really, really can tell you a lot. We talk about his early life here. And Nick's book Cross the Snow, he also talks about the later life in his time over in Cambridge at Craigie House, which is now Wadsworth Longfellow House. I mean, Longfellow House, Washington headquarters, but both great places to visit. We want to see people. Hopefully we're going to be opening again, keep our fingers crossed that, we can get through COVID and we can open back up. So dying to do it.
I don't think you can cite any other American writer. I mean, I'd be happy to hear any suggestions. Name me any other American writer that has not one, but 2 homes preserved as National Historic Sites with their original contents and furnishings, and that resonate and really follow 2 distinct periods of their lives and their creative lives. I mean, you've got that Wadsworth Longfellow House in Portland, which, as you say, was given to the state, to the Historical Society by Anne, by his sister. So there were no intervening owners. Nobody came in, got rid of the old furniture, brought in new furniture. So everything there is authentic to the Longfellow family. And then the same thing is in Cambridge. That house was turned over by the Longfellow family to the trust, which is now run by the National Park Service, to the National Park Service in the 1960s or 70s, but everything there is authentic and original. And you go to both of these places. I mean, you visit one, you have to see the other if you want a full sense of the man. And I can't think of any other writer where the materiality, I mean, really adds to the sense of the writing. I mean, the things. And the Longfellows were pack rats. They saved everything, and they preserved so many objects, which kind of give you a sense of who they were and the times in which they lived. It's like a laboratory. It was a laboratory. Both were laboratories for me, I have to say, in my writing.
Yeah, Henry, before fame, knowing that better things were coming his way, literally wrote to Anne and said, I want you to save everything.
I didn't know that. See, that's wonderful.
He said, and do not give things away. He said.
He said that? I love that.
Yeah. People, it's in a letter. He talks about it. And he said, because he knows what's coming. Okay. I mean, he was one of the pioneers, along with Charles Dickens and Washington Irving, who really, wanted to preserve the rights of writers, to have copyright and stuff like that. They didn't see it, but they wanted it. He had a lot of ways that you had talked about our last interview we did together about how he protected his work, but he knew all along that things were about to get a little better in his writing career, and he did tell Anne. So she was a bit of a pack rat too at this particular property. I mean, you look at the house, oldest piece dates back to roughly, we had it inspected 1760, and then what they refer to as the new table 1835. So, it's pretty vast collection.
I mean, you showed me a desk in that house where he sat and wrote probably his very first poems. That desk is still there.
Yep, the desk that he wrote the poem "The Rainy Day" on, and then up in the second floor of the table where he wrote "The Battle of Lovell's Pond," which was the first published poem that he wrote when he was only 13.
13. So by the time he arrived on the Bowdoin campus at the age of 15, he was already a published poet.
Yeah,
Which is a pretty amazing thing
Oh,
to
yeah.
say.
Yeah, well, he was at Bowdoin. He was
Yeah.
getting work published, so yeah,
In a variety of places too, a number of very impressive places. He was
yeah,
an amazing man.
yeah, very, very
I
lot
know,
lot of fun to write about.
I know that one of the things when I have, the opportunity to talk with visitors about Henry and his work that I like to mention is that Henry was so famous. His work, so well known. He was so admired that he had the ability to pluck stories and individuals from obscurity and make them famous too. That even if we have visitors who don't know the name Henry Wadsworth Longfellow or aren't familiar with his poetry, when I ask, "Have you ever heard of Paul Revere?" and they say, "Sure." I tell them that Henry is why you've heard of Paul Revere. So one of our someone else in the audience, Alan, is commenting, asking, it's been said that the poem Evangeline helped bring interest to Acadian history. I think that's absolutely true. I don't know. What do you gentlemen think?
I just can't imagine that wouldn't be the case. It was an extraordinarily well-read book, very popular book, hugely influential. And we all know the story about how we got the idea for that poem, right? They were having dinner at Craigie House. There was Longfellow had and Nathaniel Hawthorne had come to dinner one night, and so he had asked Hawthorne, so what are you working on these days? He says, I don't have anything. And there was a minister who had come with Hawthorne, and he said, what do you mean? I gave you an idea a couple months ago. What's wrong with that? And he said, oh, it's not in my vein, Hawthorne said. And Henry said, well, what is it? Maybe it's in my vein. And he told this story, apocryphal perhaps, or perhaps true, about this couple on their wedding day had been broken up, and the husband had been seized by the British troops up in Acadia, and they were French Canadians, and they were broken up, and she spent the rest of her life trying to find him. And of course, Henry went with Hawthorne's permission and proceeded to write this poem, which was enormously influential, not only in the United States, but all over the world. And undoubtedly, it brought attention to that particular part of the world. And because people have asked how accurate is it? For the most part, it's pretty accurate. When he starts, this is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. Well, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks really weren't there at that time. They had been deforested. It had been a little more populated by the time. So Henry had never actually visited there himself, but he was going from published sources. But for the most part, it was a very accurate, very authentically written poem. And it really, when people criticize him for Paul Revere's right for a few historical inaccuracies he made. He wasn't trying to tell a history story there.
Right. I think that, it misses the point.
It totally misses
Right,
the point of what that poem was all about, And again, it brought a very important, but otherwise relatively unknown figure in the American Revolution, and made him this, Paul Revere, who you find statues erected to all over the United States, most prominently in Boston, at the Paul Revere House, and it's a wonderful story. But I think that's happened in many cases. I write about one instance when he was married to Fanny, and they were getting letters from people, and there's a very, very important person in England. He's a very wealthy member of Parliament, House of Lords, and he was a great collector, and he had these prize bulls and cows, and they said that he had named this prize bull Hiawatha. This is from another poem, of course, Hiawatha, and the prize cow Minnehaha, after the female hero of that poem. I mean, this is how influential these poems were.
Everybody knew.
Everybody was quoting them, citing them, and so it just couldn't help but to be influential, I think, in bringing a certain place alive to people all over the world.
Well, thank you again. Thank you both so much for being here to talk about this book, the poem, Henry and his poetry. Don't forget, folks, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the Village Blacksmith, or of John's biography of Henry, or Nick's biography of Henry, you can visit our museum store online at mainhistorystore.com. If you visit our website, mainhistory.org, you can learn more about how to visit our store in Portland in person. You can learn more about our museum. You can also download a free app of the Wadsworth Longfellow House. The house is closed at the moment, but if you would like a virtual experience on that app, you can see photographs, you can listen to a guided tour of the house, learn more about Henry and a lot of the objects of his family preserved in the house. So please visit our website, and that's also where you can see the recording of this program and of other programs, including our book talk on Cross of Snow with Nick. Gentlemen, was there anything else that you wanted to add before we close this evening's program?
No, but I just want to really thank you for opening the program up with reading the poem from the new book. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I really appreciate that. Nick, such a pleasure to have you here, folks. I'm telling you, as a Longfellow scholar, Nick's book, Cross of Snow, is amazing. Okay. I go to
You're
what
too kind, John, but thank you. So thank you. From
Well,
coming
for
from you,
the notes
that's
for
a
today, I
tremendous
was like, for
compliment.
the
Thank you.
interview and stuff, I was like, I'm going and I'm like, oh, Nick, page 164. Oh, Nick, stuff. It's got a lot of great
I have
information.
to say, nobody knows more about Longfellow than you, John. So coming from you, that kind of compliment is really special. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So much. Really appreciate you being here.
Well, the pleasure's all mine.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining us. Hope to see you back here real soon.
Okay.